Hey guys, thank you so much for coming to my channel. If you have been here before, thank you for coming back. And if this is your first time, thank you for stopping by. My name is Nicole and I am a Scrum Master. On today's topic, we're going to talk about the definition of ready, DoR, and the definition of done, DoD. So what are these definitions and what do they really mean? So the definition of ready and the definition of done are simply a checklist that sets expectations of when a user story is planned, developed, and completed in the sprint. So these are just agreement that the development team members come together and say, these are the things that we as a team want to agree on before we say we can start doing the development work on this user story. And these are the things that we as a team are agreeing that before we say this story is done, there's no more work needed, before we mark this story done, these are the things that we want to make sure that we have achieved before we are marking all these stories done. So the definition of ready are simply, for example, could just be that the description, every user story must have a clear description that's understood by the entire team members. We want to make sure that all of our user stories has clear description that's understood by the entire team members. When I mean the entire team members, I mean like the developers and also the QA, right? Because user story get worked by the developers, and then once the developer is done, they now move the user story to QA. Then the QA now will do the testing. So we want to make sure that they understand the description before they even accept this user story into the sprint. We want to also make sure that all of our user story has acceptance criteria that's understood by the development team members as well. What are the acceptance criteria of this user story? Let's make sure that we document the acceptance criteria on the user story itself. So all of our user stories should have acceptance criteria before we're accepting the story into the sprint. We want to make sure that the team members understand the user story to a point where they're able to tell us the level of effort. They're able to tell us how long it would take them to deliver this story. If you're working in a 2-week sprint, you want to make sure that the development team members are able to estimate the story, how long it will take them in that 2-week sprint to complete this work. So before the development team members are accepting any user story into the sprint, maybe they want to include in the definition of ready that every user story must be estimated. And then also, the team members should decide on how they want to estimate the story. What method do they want to estimate the story? Maybe they want to also include that in their definition of ready as well. We want to use maybe the planning poker technique and the Fibonacci sequence, for example. If that's what they're agreed on, let's make sure that the team is using that method of estimating the story before they're saying that the story is ready to be worked on. We definitely want to also make sure that in our definition of ready, if there's any dependency, right? If our story is depending on another user's story, we want to keep track on this story that our story is depending on. What story is this story depending on? And is this user story depending from another team member story from a different team? Or is this user story depending on another team member story on the same team? What is this user story? And we want to make sure that if there's any dependency, has this story that our story is depending on, have they accepted this other user story? Has the developer from the other team accepted the other user story? The reason I'm saying this is because if your story is depending on another user story, and if they have not accepted the other user story, then your developer's user story might get blocked. He might not be able to move on with his work in the sprint until the other story that's depending on has been accepted by a developer, and they also tell a timeline. They're able to estimate how long it will take them to deliver this work. So definition of ready would just pretty much help your team members to pretty much be aligned on the things that they want to agree on before they say that this story is ready for us to accept in the sprint, before we can even start development work, before we can even start doing any implementation of this user story. Does this user story has everything that it takes? Do we understand the description? Do we understand the acceptance criteria? Are we able to estimate this story? Does this user story have dependency? And has this dependency been tracked? we want to make sure that we have all of these things ready on our user story before we accept this user story in our sprint. These are just some few examples of your definition of ready. Every Scrum team should come up with their own definition of ready, right? If you join a new team, and they don't have a definition of ready and definition of done, I will really encourage you, the Scrum Master, to maybe help your team to come up with their definition of ready and the definition of done. So now, what is the definition of done then? The definition of done, like I mentioned again, is just a list of expectation, right? It's a checklist that sets the expectation of before the team member says, this user story is done. Before we mark this user story to done, has this story met our definition of done? Has this story met our definition of done? Can we say that no work is needed on this user story? Everything has been done as stated in this user story before we mark this story done. What are the things that we as a team want to make sure that we accomplish before we mark this story done? For example, a definition of done can just simply mean that all the requirements that's stated in the user story has been achieved. Everything that was stated in the user story, acceptance criteria, has been achieved. And then also, if there was any testing needed on this user story, has testing been done, right? Has the testing team completed all the testing? Was there any bug or defect that was discovered? Has they resolved these issues? If the story needs to be demoed to the business at the end of the sprint, has the team demoed this user story to the business? Did they get the feedbacks that they need to make all the changes that they have to before we can say the story is done? So we just want to make sure that every requirement that was stated in the user story has been delivered, has been achieved, before the team now can say this story has met their definition of done, before they can move this story and mark this story done. So again, those are just some few examples. You might want to check with your team if they have a definition of ready and definition of done. If they don't, like I said, please do make sure that you have a session with your team members for them. Just guide them and explain to them that it's really good to have our definition of ready and definition of done, so we are all aligned, and it's going to help you guys to not have a lot of confusion before the team members are accepting story. Do we have all it takes before we can start working on this story? Before the team member says this story is completed, have we achieved everything that we have said in our definition of ready, of definition of done, before we are moving this story to done? So that's pretty much it. And another thing that I want to also mention is definition of done is not at the acceptance criteria. The definition of done is specific for all the user stories, right? However, the acceptance criteria are only specific for the particular, every user story has a different acceptance criteria. Not every user story has the same acceptance criteria, but our definition of done is for everything that our team is going to be working on. It's the same definition that we want to follow through for all of our user story, whereas the acceptance criteria is for those specific user stories. That's it, guys. So if you do have any other question, any topic, any comments, do let me know. You can email me at Nicole.agilepractitioner@gmail.com, and also you can leave me a comment below. And do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. So thank you so much, and again, I will see you guys soon.